So we have transitioned. We were living in the world of seichel, in the world of objectivity, in the world of analysis, in the world of, I suppose for the purposes of our conversation, in the world of coming to understand and appreciate what is truly valuable in life. But we have transitioned. Now we're in the world of midos. Midos are attributes, characteristics, personal traits, the responses that we have as people to the things that come our way in life. So that gives us a 7-step program we've got to work through. 7-step program of midos. Any person who is capable of achieving any real midos growth in 7 steps, you should please take over the shira for next week, because obviously that's a high ideal. So really what we're trying to do over here, remember last week we spoke a little bit about the fact that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. So that becomes the template for creation that we experience, as opposed to the 3 aspects, Chochmah, Bin, and Das, which are what Hashem did, so to speak, before the creation of the world. That's beyond the creation of the world. That is the so-called planning for creation. We also spoke about the idea that in order to conquer the land of Canaan and turn it into a holy land, so what needs to happen is you have to conquer the 7 nations that live in Canaan. And only when Mashiach comes do we get to expand and conquer the nations called the Keni, the Knizi, and the Kadmoni, which represent the intellect, the Seichel, Chochmah, Bin, and Das. But the point is that the vast majority of what we're supposed to be doing in life is working with these 7 midos and looking to modify them. So as much as it's interesting to learn about the Sephiros and what they represent, it's most meaningful and useful for us to focus in on these 7 traits. Now, as we've been doing all along, we're going to observe them from our perspective, what it means in human experience, and we're going to use that as a means just to be able to understand and appreciate how things are in the divine perspective. Because again, Hashem created the world using these 7 attributes. So that means that the better we understand them, the more we understand the nature of our world. Now, just to make this a little bit more interesting and intriguing, we know obviously that there are different days of the week. For example, I could very well have said, so far, this has been a Blue Monday. And they're not so uncommon, right? People often speak about the concept of a Blue Monday, that things just really don't seem to go according to plan. On the other hand, a Sundays are, okay, for us, we live in the diaspora, so we call Sunday Shabbos Sheni Shel Goluyos. Right? It's like, you have a second day of Yom Tov outside of Israel, so we have a second day of Shabbos outside of Israel, Sunday. It's a day of relaxation. It's a day where everything is a little bit easier. So we can understand that Sunday is associated with a very generous or kind or tolerant kind of an energy. And so it goes through each day of the week. We can identify that whatever the energy is that is associated with that particular midah, that is going to be an energy that is associated with the day of the week that was created with that particular energy. Does that make sense? And then it gets even more interesting because we're told that Elef Shonim Be'einecha K'yoim Esmol, that King David says that 1,000 years for Hashem is the equivalent of 1 day. So our experience of 1,000 years for Hashem is just like 1 day. I'm sure you know that story where this guy has an opportunity to speak to Hashem and he can really ask for whatever he wants. So he says, Hashem, is it true that in your reality 1,000 years is like 1 day? Hashem says yes. He says, and is it true in your reality that $1 million is like $1? So Hashem says, yes, that's true. So the person says, in that case, Hashem, can I have $1? So Hashem says, tomorrow. So this idea of that Elef Shonim Be'einecha K'yoim Esmol, that 1,000 years in our experience, like 1 day for Hashem, means that if there are 6 days of creation and then a 7th day of rest, then there are 6 millennia of human history, and the 7th millennium is a time of rest. That's what people always talk about, what they call the Elef Hashishi, that there's going to be this next millennium where, whether you like it or not, Mashiach has to be here. But that also means that you could take the 6 millennia of history, and you can actually link them to these energies, the same energies that you're going to identify with the days of the week. You're going to also be able to identify with the millennia of history. And that's where it gets very, very interesting. So there are quite a number of layers that we could look at as we go through this process. But before we can do any of that, of course, we have to define what these different midos are. So we're going to start obviously with the first. And again, if you looked at that map, that sheet, the layout of the Sephiros, so we're going to talk about Chesed. Chesed is in the right-hand column. So you've got chokhmah, which is in the right-hand column, and then chesed is the next item in the right-hand column. So it tells you that there's obviously an association between chesed and chokhmah. We're not going to right now go into what that association is, but there obviously must be an association. So if somebody were to ask you, what is chesed? I'm absolutely certain that 90% of people would give the same answer. Right? So what if people say, what is chesed? What do people typically say? Kindness. Kindness. Fine. So kindness, giving, so it's pretty much the same concept, right? So the thing is that the minute we use the word kindness, we have automatically made a judgment about chesed. Because if we call it kindness, we naturally associate that with something positive. Kindness is positive, surely. Wherever you go, it's become very, what do they say now? It's cool to be kind. It's become a thing. Even on the billboards, some of the billboards have these signs that come up occasionally that just say, be kind. So kindness is obviously something people are attracted to, people appreciate. It's obviously a good thing. And we naturally then have that bias that we think, oh, chesed is kindness, so therefore chesed has to be good. One of the most important things we have to know about midos is that in Kabbalah, they call midos kefulos. That's what they call them, kefulos. They're all doubles or buddies or twins, because the implication is that every one of these midos could be positive or it could be negative. There is no such thing as putting a label on one of the midos and therefore assuming automatically that it is positive. Depends on who's practicing this particular midah, depends on how it's being used, and it depends on the context, where and when it's being used. Chesed is not always positive. So let's try and understand other versions, alternatives to the word kindness. So you said giving. Giving is a good one. What else? What else would we associate with? No, that's not chesed. Tough love is not chesed. It's not chesed. So what's chesed? Love is chesed. Okay, so what do we got? Let's say kindness, giving, tolerance, love, patience, caring. Okay, not compassion. Not compassion. Compassion is something else. And we have to make that distinction. It's a very important distinction. Generosity, right? Benevolence. These are things that fall into the category of chesed. Now, when you hear any of those words, naturally you imagine, wow, those are all positive things. They're all positive things. Not only that, but we know that they were told, Olam Chesed Yiboneh, that Hashem built the world on a bedrock of chesed. The whole underpinning of the world is chesed. So that also sounds incredibly positive. You know, Hashem is giving and sharing and radiating light and goodness and bracha and life. It all sounds really, really positive. So we naturally have this association that chesed must be a positive thing. So we're going to have to analyze that and just try and understand whether or not that is the case. So let's go through each of these and think, how could each of these become unhealthy? So kindness, how could kindness become unhealthy? Too much kindness. So what's an example of too much kindness? Correct. Indulgence. That's a great word. Indulgence. Indulgence is a great word.
It doesn't allow the child to come into repentance.
Oh, great. Okay, so there's an excellent example. So would you call that kindness? In other words, if I'm an observer of that parent's behavior, where the parent is not allowing the child independence, would I call that kindness? Or maybe I'd use a different word. What might I say? What's that? Overindulgent? Or, okay, unwise is, you could say, is any midah that's not being used well, is unwise. Overindulgent? Overindulgence is a good word. What other word could we use besides over? What's that?
Spoiling.
Crippling is the effect.
No.
That's the effect. But spoiling. But so what are they doing? What are they doing? Too much. That's the point. It's too much. So to go back to the idea that too much kindness is unhealthy, that's exactly what it is. It's just that the person who's practicing that kindness, if you tell them you're being too kind, they might be mortally offended. How can you say it to me? It's my child. How can you tell me I'm being too kind to my child? So would it be helpful to come to the person and say, listen, stop being so kind to your child? That's not going to talk to them. But the reality is, what we're identifying over here, and why you're using expressions like too much, or too much kindness, or overindulgence, the truth is you could very easily just slip that into another category. You could say it's overbearing. Similar concept. It's overbearing. It could be suffocating. Smothering, right? All of these things are also variants of chesed. Now that doesn't sound right. Immediately we bristle when we hear that. How could you possibly say that chesed could be smothering, that chesed could be overbearing? Well, that's exactly the point. We hear this often where people say that it's the way that a person expresses their love is overbearing, is smothering. People say that, right? That's a different concept.
What is that also getting, say, you give money to someone and you think they're going to use it for good and then use it?
Okay, so what do we call that? What do we call that? Enablement. So enabling is a chesed problem. Only chesed people are enablers. Let that sink in, right? Only chesed people become enablers. Gevura people can have other toxic behaviors, which we'll get to when we talk about Gevura. But chesed people are the enablers.
Just a long time ago, there was somebody, a woman who lost her husband, and when we got to speak to Mrs. Goldfarm, it was a mom in school or something, and Mrs. Goldfarm said that we wanted to, everybody wanted to do it, and whatever, and she said, you've got to be careful the way that you give, you giving the way that the person needs it.
Yes.
Not just because you want to.
Exactly.
And save them.
Exactly.
It needs to be the right way for them.
That's right. So sometimes when everybody rushes in to save a person in a difficult situation, the motivation is very positive. The result is not always so positive, right? So, okay, good. There's a very interesting point. Not to be selfish and chesed. That's very interesting. Very, very interesting. Why is that so interesting? Because if a person's primary trait is chesed, then very likely the chesed is self-serving. I know it's not easy for a person to hear that, but very often it's self-serving. So for example, let's say that we're driving down the road and somebody comes to our window and says, listen, I haven't had anything to eat. Now, there are various responses that people have to that. Some people, the first thing they do, obviously they see the person coming, they're already ready for them, they've got their coins or their sandwiches or whatever it is, and as soon as the person comes to the window, they give it to them, and they say to them, hello, and how are you? And they really treat them very nicely. Other people are on the opposite extreme. They're like, can't stand this. This is such an invasion. Every time I stop my car, somebody comes over. Can't the government take care of them? Can't somebody else? Why is it my problem? And then you get the person who doesn't just simply roll down the window, give the person something, throw out a platitude, but they actually get to know the person over time. You pass the same beggar on the street corner week after week, day after day, whatever it is, that you get to know them, they take an interest, they find things at home that they know will be useful to them, whatever the case. Those are three different responses. Only one of them is chesed. So out of the three responses, which is the one that's chesed? The first person. The first person who's ready, because that's me. I'm that kind of person. I like to give, I like to help people. So therefore I've got my whole system in place. I don't want to get involved in their lives. That's not necessary as long as I'm helping them. Because chesed can be quite self-serving. I need to feel like I'm a good person. So in order for me to feel like a good person, every time somebody approaches me for help, I have to be able to help them. Whereas the other two scenarios, we'll get to what they are, but they're not chesed. Neither of the other two scenarios is chesed. So who would be the paragon of chesed in our tradition? Abraham, right? We all know that. We all know that Abraham is the ultimate person of chesed. Now, let's examine Abraham's life and understand what that means. Where do you see chesed in Abraham's life? What are and of course, some of these things are going to be easier than others to identify, but let's just have a look through it and try and see what do we identify in Abraham's life that tells us, this is a person of chesed. So what about the Malachim? He served them, right? So here you've got a person who's just had a very serious experience in his life. He's an older man, he's just had a bris. He's sitting outside, it's a boiling hot day, and yet what? It's almost like he can't help himself. That's what it looks like, right? Because his whole persona is chesed, so it's almost like he can't help himself. Like he is pained by the fact that there are no guests. And Rashi even points out that Hashem made it an especially hot day, so that there wouldn't be guests, so as not to burden Avram, and it bothers him. Like, why? Because if I'm a person of chesed and I'm not able to give, that is painful. Now we know that from our own experience because all of us have this to some extent in our experience, particularly as parents. If I can't help my child, it pains me, right? So that's what's happening to Abraham over here. But it's not just the fact that he goes and he helps the angels when they come and appear to him. That's his whole life. His whole life is hospitality. He's got this hotel in the middle of the desert, and he's just running out there giving the best service and the best meals to anybody who comes past. So you can see that Avram is a person of Chesed, right? Yes, would you agree? It's a person of Chesed? Okay, good. Can you give me another example of where Avram is a person of Chesed?
He argues with Hashem.
Correct. He goes and he debates with Hashem to try and save the people of Sodom. Now, if I was a more discerning person, a person who had higher expectations, I'd say, you know what? Quite frankly, the people of Sodom, they deserve to be taken out. They're a horrible bunch. They behave absolutely abhorrently, and Hashem obviously knows what he's doing. Not Avram, right? Avram is there and he's arguing, and maybe we could find a way, and maybe there's 50 tzaddikim or 20 tzaddikim, all the way down to 10 tzaddikim. Now, maybe there's a way to save these people. Okay, so we have two pieces of evidence now that Avram is a person of Chesed. What else? Those were the easy ones, right? Okay. What else?
He's letting Lot choose which part of the land.
I wouldn't say that allowing Lot to choose where he wants to go is a sign of Chesed. However, there is something about Lot which is a very clear story of Chesed. What is it?
That he took him in.
That he goes to rescue him. Avram puts his life on the line and he goes chasing. Now, Lot landed up in that mess because of his poor choices. So if I was a more discerning person than Avram was, I would say, listen, you make your bed, lie in it. There's nothing I can do. It's unfortunate. I gave you options. You decided you're going to go live in this indulgent, materialistic valley of Sodom, and now, unfortunately, it's come back to bite. Please don't come crying to me. But Avram doesn't say any of that, right? He puts his life on the line and he goes chasing after these kings and he rescues Lot and he actually saves the day for the whole people of Sodom. It's a fascinating story, right? Okay, where else?
With his wife, saying it's his sister.
Is that Chesed?
Well, you're protecting him.
Oh, he's protecting himself. Right? Because when he says that Sarah is his sister, what does he say? That they're going to take you and kill me. So they were going to take her regardless, right? Whether he says sister or wife, they were still going to abduct Sarah. So that doesn't sound like a Chesed story. That sounds like a self-protection story. Okay? That's the second time, right? We're talking. But he davens for Avimelech. That's true. True. That's a story of Chesed.
Can Chesed be to yourself too, to be kind to yourself?
Well, okay, good question. Can you hold that question? It's a very good question. Let's hold that thought. That's a really interesting thought.
What about breaking all the idols?
Is that Chesed? Breaking the idols? Is that Chesed? Oh, so you're saying he's protecting people from doing what's wrong, and therefore that would be an act of Chesed. It's an interesting perspective. So let's leave that one as a maybe. Okay? Thank you. That's what I was waiting for. Okay? The biggest indicator of Avram's Chesed is his treatment of Yishmael and his battle with the fact that he has to kick Yishmael out of the house. That tells you everything that you need to know about Avram being a person of Chesed, because if he was, like Sarah was, clearly a person of Gevurah, then it's very clear. Yishmael's a bad influence. He's not upholding the family values. He's pretty much broken every rule. He's engaged in idolatry. He's doing target practice with his younger brother. He challenges the whole hierarchy of the family, and Avram can't bring himself to get rid of Yishmael. He needs Hashem to tell him that you have to listen to Sarah, and only then can he send Yishmael on his way. But his nature is Chesed. He doesn't want to do this. Okay? All right, so let's, before we go to one more story about Avram, which is a very important story, let's just circle back for a second to that question about Chesed. Can Chesed be kindness to yourself? It's very popular in today's world, right? That we talk so much about you must be kind to yourself. And unfortunately, I think this is one of those examples of where English falls short of what the Torah is actually speaking about. Because Chesed and kindness are not identical. So what is Chesed really? I think the best way to understand the distinction between Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferes, which are the first three of the Midos, is to look at it this way. Every one of us has a center of gravity. And then we have a world around us. So anytime that we're going to engage with the world around us, that means we're going to have to pull a little bit away from our center of gravity. For some people, that comes easier. For some people, that's really challenging. So, for example, in our society, we talk, and it's a relatively new psychological concept, we talk about introverts and extroverts. So an extrovert easily pulls away from their center of gravity. In fact, being in an environment of other people feeds them. An introvert finds it difficult to pull away from their center of gravity. And therefore, when they're dealing with other people, it's actually quite tiring. And they have to go back to their center of gravity in order to replenish themselves. So the extrovert is sucking energy from being around people, and the introvert is sucking energy from their center of gravity. So an extrovert would be a nice example of what Chesed is. Chesed is a movement away from my center of gravity into the space of the other. That's what Chesed is all about. And Gevura is a movement away from the other back towards my center of gravity. So we're not really talking about Gevura today, but it's sometimes you've got to just make the comparison in order to create clarity. In other words, Chesed does not have to be kind. Chesed is any action or any movement from myself outwards. That's Chesed. So being kind to myself, even though it's important, is not called Chesed. Okay? It's an interesting concept, because in English we just fudge the word kind and we say any act of benevolence is kindness. But in Torah we're much more discerning and we say if it is an act outward, it would fall into the category of Chesed. If it is an act that goes inward, even if it's an act of self-kindness, it belongs in the category of Gevura. Fascinating point, right? Okay, so let's use some examples. So positive Chesed is, there's somebody who doesn't have what they need, and I have resources. So in my world, there are resources, but I'm stepping out of my space, away from my center of gravity, to share those resources with other people. That would be an example of Chesed. Equally, those resources don't have to be financial. Those resources could potentially be knowledge. So the person who is a Chesed person is always happy to share their knowledge with others. Now, is everybody always happy to have that knowledge shared with them? Right? So that shows you how fine the line could be between healthy and unhealthy Chesed. Because Chesed, the idea, the concept of sharing your knowledge with others is a good thing. Of course, it's a positive thing. But when it's misplaced, it's called interference. But it's still in the category of Chesed. So now let's go back for a second. When Avraham Avinu goes to Hashem and he says, save the people of Sodom, it's not just because Avraham cares about people, because he is a benevolent individual. It's because he feels that he has the capacity to step into an arena that's not even his arena. Hashem has made a decision, but he has a Chesed personality, so he's going to, for lack of a better word, impose himself into that space to also weigh in and say, maybe we could do this differently. And of course, he's bringing his Chesed personality into that conversation to say, this is why I think we should do it differently, or how I think we could possibly save these people.
And it can risk that anger from the person.
From the recipient.
Yes,
exactly.
So you also
Exactly. So who's going, in which situation is Avraham Avinu putting himself at greater risk? When he's chasing after the kings to get Lot back, where the threat is a physical threat, or where he's standing up and saying to Hashem, I think there's another way, which is, how do you have the chutzpah to do that? So it's positive. It's still absolutely positive. His motivation is a motivation of Chesed. It illustrates the core of his being, but that just shows you that Chesed isn't just simply about being nice and sweet and accepting and tolerant. Chesed is bold. And sometimes Chesed is very risky and highly courageous, depending on what the Chesed is.
Right.
Okay, it can be very brave. So that's a fascinating perspective, right? But we have an issue. The reason we have an issue is because we do also have a big story in Avram's life, which is not a story of Chesed at all, by any stretch. That's the Akedah, right? The Akedah. So you've got Hashem telling Avram, and of course it's different when Hashem tells you to do something. But you've got Hashem telling Avram that he should go up onto the mountain and shecht his son Yitzchak. That is an incredible moment in Avram's life, because 137 years worth of focus on one way of serving Hashem is now challenged to the extreme. What does that tell you? Because if you think about it, the act of taking his own son to shecht him is the most antithetical thing for a Chesed person to ever consider. What does that tell you? And by the way, after that story, Hashem says to Avram, he says, Ato yodaiti ki yirei elikim ato. now I know that you fear Hashem. What do you mean now I know? What do you mean now? After 137 years of fighting to spread the name of God throughout the entire world, after all of the sacrifice he had, being thrown into the furnace by Nimrod, these incredible moments of total dedication to Hashem, and Hashem says, now I know that you fear me, now I know that you have dedication.
Because he did Hashem's will and not just his inclination.
100%, exactly. But it's more than that. What does he say? Ata yodaiti, now I know, ki yirei Elokim ata. Now I know that you have yira. Yira is not your natural state. Yira is fear and awe. Your natural state is, as the pasuk says, Avraham oihavi. Avraham is a person who serves Hashem out of love. That's been what's driven you for all of these years, is love. But because love could be self-interested, we don't know yet that you're completely committed to Hashem until you do something that is the exact opposite of love. So if we're going to talk about midos development, there are two things we're going to have to focus on. The first thing is to identify healthy and unhealthy variations of the midah and move from the unhealthy to the healthy. The second thing that we're going to have to learn is that a person can never be a one-dimensional person. We can't only live with a single midah. To be able to have dedication to Hashem means learning to operate in arenas that are foreign to us, that go against the grain for us. But if that's what Hashem expects of us, we've got to be able to do it. Like Avraham Avinu taking a knife to his son's throat, which goes against every single fiber of his being, because he's dedicated to Hashem. So those are two things we're going to have to focus on. Now, here's the thing. If Abraham is the epitome of healthy chesed, who is the epitome of unhealthy chesed?
Oh, sorry, no.
Who is the epitome of unhealthy chesed? Not Esav? Not Lot? Not Amalek? That's an interesting one. Not Lavan? Yishmael. And that's why when it comes to the Akedah, and Hashem says to Avraham, Kachno es bincha, take your son. He says, I have two sons. What do you mean you have two sons? Why is that a consideration? You say, no, I have two, not just physical sons, I have two types of characters that have come out of my family. And actually, one is more like me than the other. Ishmael is much more like Avraham than Yitzchak is. Yitzchak is very different to Avraham. Yitzchak is the epitome of Gevurah, which we'll still talk about. But Yishmael is the one who represents Chesed. Now you're thinking, what on earth are you talking about? How could Yishmael possibly represent Chesed? What do we know about Yishmael that has anything to do with Chesed? So, yes, but so did Esav have kibbud, which is probably why you were thinking Esav, right? Has a tremendous, but even then, kibbud, honoring parents might take a lot of gevurah as well, might take a lot of discipline. It's not necessarily a natural. So where do we see that Ishmael is a person of chesed? Now remember, he's toxic chesed. So if you're looking for him being a kind person, you're looking in the wrong place. If you're looking for him being a tolerant person, you're looking in the wrong place. Because we're looking here for toxic chesed. What is toxic chesed? Too much, right? So let's mix that up a little bit. Instead of saying too much of, that's another expression for too much of is, or being overbearing, all the different adjectives that we've used so far. Another way that you could say that. Okay, another way that we could say, I'm looking for something that captures all of that. Overstepping boundaries. Because chesed is crossing a boundary, right? I have my center of gravity. I'm stepping outside of myself, away from my center of gravity. So I'm stepping outside of my boundary. And the reality is I'm stepping into somebody else's boundary. So when I go give that beggar food, the reality is I am stepping into their space. And that could be very uncomfortable for them because now they're feeling exposed that somebody has to provide for me, and that's not a comfortable place to be. So even though the act is a kind act, the reality is it's crossing a boundary. If chesed is done right, then it's okay to cross that boundary. Love is crossing a boundary. Person has their space, their life, their world, their ideals, their values. And when we love somebody, we step into that place and we now insert ourselves into their lives. And if it's a healthy relationship, then great. Then it's welcome to cross that boundary. If it's not a healthy place, it's creepy. should never cross that boundary, right? So the kind of things the affection, for example, that we show to our children, healthy. Somebody shows that level of affection to somebody else's children, problematic. So it's the same concept. In both cases, you're crossing a boundary. It's just that this is an appropriate boundary in an appropriate way, and that's an inappropriate boundary in an inappropriate way.
Like in a relationship where you get almost controlling, possessive behaviors. Is that considered
Chesed.
kind of
Chesed. Correct. That is toxic chesed. When a person becomes a controlling, let's leave out the things that are like physical abuse. That would be kavura, right? But the concept of overbearing behavior is toxic chesed. It's hard for us to process this because we've been conditioned to believing that chesed is always such a nice, comfortable, gentle thing. It doesn't have to be, which is why Yishmael fits into the world of chesed. Why? What do we know about Yishmael? What does the Torah tell us about Yishmael? Even before he was born. That what? He had many wives. That's your first indicator. Because what does it mean he had many wives? A relationship, a husband-wife relationship should be a relationship of love. In order to have healthy love, it should be contained. Here you've got too much unhealthy, uncontrolled love, so it becomes polygamy. There's an example of an unhealthy version of chesed. It's like all over the place, just, and it keeps going. Just like, marrying wives. I mean, Asaph does the same, but Asaph does it for a different reason. But that's an indication of unbridled or unhealthy chesed. Great. Another example.
Would you call it irresponsible?
Well, chesed, toxic chesed could be irresponsible. Could, absolutely. So for example, an example of being irresponsibly chesed is very tolerant. If you're tolerant of things that are unhealthy, that's irresponsible. So for example, chesed people are not good at self-discipline, diet, exercise, routine. That doesn't come naturally to them. So we look at them, we say they're irresponsible, they're undisciplined. That would be an example of toxic chesed. Okay, what do we know about Yishmael before he was born? Say that again?
That affect your weapons.
I'm saying before he was born. What do we know about him before he was born?
Was given to Abraham.
Correct. But what do we know about Yishmael before he was born? It's a very important piece of the story. Very important piece of the story. So let's remind ourselves.
Over the womb.
No, that's Asaph. Okay, so let's remind ourselves of the story. Hagar is brought into the family. That what?
Use the long for child.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. But I'm looking specifically for something that the Torah says about him. So let's remind ourselves of the story. Hagar is brought into the family, in fact, by Sarah, because Sarah is unable to have children. Why is Sarah unable to have children? Different conversation. Why does Hagar very quickly fall pregnant? In fact, Rashi says immediately. Energy of chesed. Things are easy. Just flows. It's Hashem's kindness. But then she starts taking herself too seriously as a result of that. She is correct. The first pregnancy she miscarries. That's true, and that's because of Sarah's Ein Hara, right? But then, and this is where we get into the story. So then Sarah kicks her out of the house, and she loses her first pregnancy. But then an angel appears to her and says, "Go back to the house, and go suffer under Sarah's hand, and then you will have a child." The angel promises you will have a child. And what kind of a child will you have? V'hu yiyeh pere adam. He will be a wild person. What does wild mean? Undisciplined. Wild means there's no boundaries, there are no rules. That's toxic chesed. Toxic chesed is the extreme left ideology. Everybody does as they please, identifies as they please, expects the whole world to accept realities that are untested in science. It's just like, it's wild. It's wild. It's a Yishmael reality. Anything goes, whatever you want. But that's not where it ends. The angel continues and says, Yodoi bakol. His hand will be in everything. That is toxic chesed, the belief that you've got a right to have a hand in everything, a say in everything. That is the belief. If you look at today's world and the descendants of Yishmael, you see this absolutely. We have a say in how you run your country. We're not locals. We've only been here for a few years, but we are going to tell you how you have to behave. Our people have to be leaders in your government. You've got to be able to respect our attitudes in your spaces. That is toxic chesed. If you think an overbearing mother or mother-in-law or whoever it is toxic chesed, scale that up by 1,000 and you get Yishmael's reality. Okay, so that is where you've got the two sides of the coin side by side. Abraham and Yishmael, healthy, wholesome chesed, Abraham, and wild, unmitigated chesed, Yishmael. So when we look in the mirror, especially now in the month of Elul, we have to ask ourselves, where on that spectrum is our chesed? Is our chesed all about benevolence and goodness and kindness? Or is our chesed possibly about overstepping boundaries or possibly being undisciplined? And once we identify that, that's when we can actually start to work on a midah. We have to understand how the midah works. We have to be honest about how it works within ourselves. And that's where growth actually starts to happen.